And to tell us further, in the studio we have today Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyung Hee University. Professor, it's good to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Now, as we heard in the previous report, at the forum in Washington, Unification Minister Cho Myoung-gyon said that South Korea will push for a positive cycle in developing inter-Korean relations along with denuclearization, and there won't be a change to the country's fundamental position. Now, his remarks come at a time when the Korea and Washington appear to be on diverging lines in terms of sanctions or dealing with the U.S. The U.S. says it will maintain pressure until complete denuclearization, while Seoul wants to pursue inter-Korean projects. How should we interpret his remarks?
I think there has arisen kind of a need to address some rough patches between South Korea and the U.S. in terms of how to deal with North Korea. Remember last week, the Kim Young-cheol's visit, North Korean Vice Chairman Kim Young-cheol's visit to Pyongyang has been canceled or rescheduled. We don't know where it is. But it was perceived as an indication that North Korea is unwilling or unready to talk seriously about the verification issue. And there is the kind of eerie deja vu feeling regarding this, because we were here at that point 10 years ago. In 2008, there was a talk between the verification and denuclearization, much the same as we were having, but then North Korea pulled out when it got to a really minor point of the verification. So I think if that's the situation, I think the important thing is to have a same voice between the allies dealing with North Korea, especially between the South Korea and the U.S. And the news reports have made it sound like South Korea is getting ahead of itself and not really having a close cooperation or coordination with the U.S. in terms of requiring the verification. I think Cho emphatically said that that's not the case. If anything, in terms of inter-Korean relationship or the economic cooperation were to happen, that's after the verification issue is properly addressed.
Now, the Unification Minister is also scheduled to sit down for talks with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Now, there's no doubt that they'll have lots to talk about. Firstly, they'll have to devise measures to stimulate the denuclearization talks between North Korea and the U.S. The two allies also have to discuss the launching of their joint working group on the North's denuclearization. And South Korea also has a list of inter-Korean projects that it wants to pursue. Do you think any significant outcome will come out of these talks?
I think the attempt or the working group is a very significant element in making progress in this for a couple of reasons. One is learning from what we have seen in the failure of 2008 that I just mentioned. I think we need more elaborate or very detailed roadmap as to how to get there. Second, if the unwillingness is there, to an extent it's understandable from North Korea's point of view. They don't want to be next to Libya, they don't want to be next Iraq, and post-Trump or post-even Moon, nothing is assured in terms of how the talks or the peace regime will go. So we have to have a very concrete peace regime to be installed so that North Korea would not worry too much about what's going to happen to their even survival.
Now, there's a new report coming from Pyongyang state media that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un inspected a test of a newly developed high-tech weapon. Now, this marks the first field inspection by the North Korean leader since November last year. They didn't specify what weapon it was exactly, but it does come at a time when the talks between the U.S. have hit a snag. What's your view on this?
I don't think it's anything special at this point, but that's a little bit of a caveat. North Korea always had this attitude that in order to get the attention from the world community, especially during the negotiation stage, they demand or require constant attention. It's like a crying baby always needing to be pacified. I think there is a little bit of intention to turn up the heat a little bit, escalate the tension so that the attention on the North Korean issue for the United States or the South Korea would not put in the back burner.
Now, some sources within South Korea say it was a long-range artillery, and a senior official from the South Korean government on the condition of anonymity said that North Korea's test of this high-tech weapon should not be interpreted as abandoning denuclearization talks. So can we say that they aren't adding fuel to fire?
I think there is a little bit of caution in terms of how they go about it. That the North Korea I think tested not the strategic weapons but tactical weapons. Tactical weapons are local weapon for the local combat, but strategic weapons, that's what U.S. has worried about. So not making it explicit that they are going after the development of strategic weapons. I think that North Korea is saying two things at the same time. One, we want to talk with the U.S. and this the negotiation process to continue, but at the same time they want to be cautious about not really escalating too much tension as against the United States.
Then could something like this be used as a leverage on Pyongyang's part or act as a variable in the resumption of their stalled dialogue?
At this point, I think there's a larger context or situation in that a lot of the progress has been made between the two big personalities, Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, who tend to be, can be very unconventional about this. I think the midterm election is over, and the domestic woes because of the lower house has flipped in the U.S. I think a lot of attention has been taken away from the North Korea for the Trump. So I think there is a need to kind of look for a occasion to resume this talk, and if there's nothing like that, then probably it'll kind of drag on. And Donald Trump already said that they're not in a hurry and they're going to do the waiting game if they need to. So at this point, if that's the situation, we might have to expect a little bit more escalation from the North Korea going forward.
So amid this breakdown in the dialogue between North Korea and the U.S., inter-Korean exchanges are still taking place. On Thursday, Lee Hae-chan, the chief of South Korea's ruling party, met with Lee Jong-hyuk, vice chairman of the Korean Asia-Pacific Peace Committee, who is also in charge of inter-Korean ties, to discuss ways to boost cultural exchanges and tourism. Would you say such meetings have laid the groundwork for further boosting exchanges between the two Koreas?
Well, I think so. Of course, a lot of people will say that without the deal between the North Korea and the U.S., anything and everything that happens is for naught. They are all reversible, and we have seen this before. We advance inter-Korean relationship, but if nothing happens, then it just stops. But I don't think that's the case. For one thing, we're following up on the agreement that they had in a couple of summits here, and I think that at this point, by forging nexus, network, and the interrelationships in many different areas, not only the military, but the aviation that we are seeing, and culturally. I think there is a thing called death by 1,000 paper cuts. I think that from our standpoint, rather than waiting for the big bang moment of the denuclearization, I think there has to be a countless threads of relationships between North and South so that it'll help. It might not be the decisive factor, but is a factor in the environment that makes other development all the more important and effective.
So staying on the agreements that we've reached so far, South Korea has demolished part of the board guard post with explosive device as part of the inter-Korean agreement to withdraw such installations inside the DMZ. North Korea also publicized photos of the dismantlement. These signs of division over the decades are slowly becoming part of history now. Now, despite the symbolism, can we also say that it's brought about significant progress on the defense front?
I wouldn't say it's a significant but it's very symbolic, and I think it's emblematic of what has been happening at least between the North and South Korean relations. So going back to the theme of we have to increase the relationship and also the details of how we ease the tensions. I think those kind of efforts need to continue, and coupled with getting rid of all those landmines, I think this is a positive movement.
So, South and North Korea also held a meeting on Friday to discuss cooperation in the aviation sector. North Korea is known to have requested the meeting, and it comes at a time, especially when joint negotiations on connecting roads and railways are seemingly at a standstill due to concerns over sanctions. Now, Pyongyang has reportedly called for the opening of western and eastern air routes, and Seoul's Unification Ministry is known to have said that further discussions are needed. Can we say on this part that North Korea is trying to focus on economic development, or what significance will the opening of airspace have for the regime?
Certainly, Kim Jong-un has made it clear that the next goal that he wants to achieve is economic development. But of course, that's the same thing that his father said back in 2005 and 2008, actually. So we'll have to look at it with a little bit of a suspicion, but I think that economic cooperation being a very important element in not only the securing the prosperity between the two countries, but in terms of regime stability and the stability of the peace regime that we hopefully will put in, I think that those kind of exchanges and the infrastructure laying is very important. Apparently, the communication and transportation will be one of the keys in terms of economic cooperation. Of course, as we go back to what Minister Cho was saying, the economic cooperation will not really start in earnest before the verification issue of the new denuclearization is achieved. But even as a preparation, I think it's a worthwhile subject matter to delve into.
Now, the South Korean government believes that the opening of a direct route for passenger airplanes between the two Koreas is possible even under the current sanctions regime. What's your take on this? And if that's so, or do you think we'll have to wait until talks between the U.S. and North Korea are back on track?
Well, technically it might be possible, but it's under the assumption that if there is a usual fee that the internationally nations charge if they're using another's airspace. If any fee is being paid, I think that would be going against the sanctions that was instituted by not only South Korea but the U.S. as well. And the U.S. has ruled that any aircraft that has been in the North Korean airspace has to wait 180 days before they enter the U.S. airspace. So in terms of those kind of details, probably it's very tough to do. And even if it doesn't really go directly against the sanctions regime at this point instituted by UN or the US will look at South Korea with a little bit of concern and suspicion whether the South Korea is firmly in step with the US. I think that's why that this discussion is happening only through the initiation of North Korea. Probably South Korea is not really ready to go into full force, the setting up the infrastructure for the airspace or the airway to make the transportation route possible. Even for the civilian, the tourism, I think that will be counted as a category of economic exchanges and changing hands in terms of financial matters. So I think that South Korea will be extremely cautious in proceeding in that route.
Speaking of sanctions, there were mounting speculation that the talks between the North Korea and U.S. was called off due to differences over sanctions relief. Do you think the two sides, the two allies, will be able to coordinate something through the meeting between South Korea's Unification Minister and U.S. Secretary of State?
I think the sanctions issue is the key. I think it goes with the verification and sanction issues. Where we failed in 2008, probably this time around, the hope is that the South Korea will play the mediator role to make the environment possible for the North Korea to dispel their concerns about becoming next Libya and Iraq and make a big decision. I think that has been the theme, and President Moon has bent over backwards several times to urge North Korea and also make environment possible for the U.S. and the world community. But I think at this point, going back to the working group and how the environment can be forged so that North Korea can make the big decision. I think the role of South Korea in terms of mediator role is much more important. But I think it ultimately depends on whether North Korea does have that intention to make the big decision at all at this point.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you.